We'll get back to our breaking news this hour. And U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton's comments lashing out at Russia and China, reiterating basically her previous claims that the two are supporting the Assad regime and that they must face consequences. Pay the price, she said. Now, those comments were made in Paris, where members of the so-called Friends of Syria are meeting this Friday. Let's get more now from RT's Peter Oliver. He is following these latest developments. Peter, so a Friends of Syria meeting, not exactly sounding all that friendly, is it, Peter?
Well, not friendly at all. We've heard really a threat from the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton to Russia and China, saying that they will have to pay the price for what she sees as their support of the Assad government. Now, from Russia's point of view, their opinion on Syria hasn't changed. They've blamed both the government forces and the opposition troops for the ongoing violence in the country. Now, this is somewhat of an inconsistent message coming out of Washington, coming out of the Office of the Secretary of State there. Just a week ago in Geneva, at a meeting of international partners on Syria, the United States agreed that it would be only through both sides laying down their weapons and coming to the table to talk that peace could be achieved. Now, a week on, she's back to saying that Assad must go and that Russia and China are helping him. Now, the similar inconsistencies that we've seen from what Hillary Clinton had to say today also regard the subject of helicopters. Now, Mrs. Clinton saying that Russian helicopters are currently being used to kill civilians in Syria. Now, we've heard from the Foreign Ministry here in Russia that there is a shipment of helicopter parts, disassembled helicopters, on their way from Russia to Syria. However, it would take more than a month to reassemble those aircraft once they arrive on Syrian soil. So they can't be being used at the moment for what Mrs. Clinton says is the use of Russian technology to kill civilians. So an inconsistent approach and a threat coming from the US Secretary of State.
All right, we, of course, will continue to keep track of whether we have any kind of Russian reaction to those words that Russia and China will have to pay for so-called their support of President Assad. Peter Oliver, live for us with those developments. Thanks for that. Well, let's discuss that latest development around the Syrian conflict with Mark Ament, who's a visiting professor of international relations at Bilkent University in Turkey. He joins us now live from the UK, I believe. Professor Ament, thanks again for once again being with us. What do you make of Clinton's latest statement? Russia and China will have to pay. Just a week ago in Geneva, Moscow and Washington seemed to find common ground, it looked like, on the Syrian conflict, that they would try to pursue a method of both sides having to answer.
Yeah, well, I think this is part of the problem, is that the United States has its own solution and is not prepared to see any compromise or any input from other important countries. So if you remember, after the Geneva meeting, Mrs. Clinton a claim rather than a process of change. So Russia had made some concessions, it hadn't gone far enough. And I think the rhetoric of Mrs. Clinton recalls that of the Bush era. There's a great deal of continuity in international policy between George Bush and Barack Obama's administrations. After all, when France, Russia and China opposed the invasion of Iraq in 2003, Condoleezza Rice threatened President Chirac by name that he would pay a price. And think of the destruction of his reputation and his fall from public esteem afterwards, and indeed even the criminal charges brought against him in France. And I think the problem now is that Mrs. Clinton is, in a sense, personalizing this. She is saying that there can't be any dissent. On the one hand, the United States is promoting democracy, and one presumes pluralism, but on the other hand, only her particular line is acceptable. And unless you fall into line, you are declared to be an enemy. And this is a very dangerous situation, because she's converting a regional problem, the crisis in Syria and in its neighbors, into potentially a global problem if you say that countries like Russia and China, by extension India, South Africa and Brazil, other important countries that don't agree with every dot of the line of Mrs. Clinton, are to be considered supporters of tyranny and enemies of the good. This is really creating a much more dangerous global atmosphere.
I think we can agree, and many would agree, strong words, really. What kind of price could Secretary Clinton been talking about? I mean, are we going to see any concrete action?
Well, we don't know. I mean, there are ranges of actions the United States and its allies can take economically, although of course they're heavily dependent particularly on Chinese finance in the United States, and the European allies of the United States are heavily dependent upon Russian oil and gas. We already have sanctions on Iran. Do we really want to create further economic problems by pursuing that kind of line? Maybe there are informal methods. Of course, today in the Russian Duma there are discussions about a law requiring foreign-funded NGOs in Russia to register their support and their cash coming from abroad. And in other countries in the former Soviet bloc, US cash and cash from the European Union countries has helped to bring about regime change. So there is, if you like, the implied threat that perhaps the Russian government, the Chinese government, other governments of the United States doesn't regard really as democratic, or not necessarily even universally regarded as democratic as China is not, could well face these kinds of subversive approaches. So there is a risk out of all this. And as I say, the fact is maybe Mrs. Clinton is simply speaking out of frustration at the fact that her policy has not yet achieved its goal of overthrowing Assad. But the likelihood must be that in Moscow and Beijing and other countries where the US policy isn't supported, that governments may feel threatened, that they may feel their security in some sense is threatened by this kind of rhetoric. And Mrs. Clinton, after all, is given to very harsh rhetoric towards people she doesn't like. Remember her comments on Gaddafi. We came, we saw, he died. That was broadcast on American television. Falling out with Mrs. Clinton can prove fatal.
Just briefly, Professor Ahmed, we talked about Geneva ending in a support of both sides having to answer for the conflict, but also the first step, Kofi Annan's also a push for both the government and rebels to be blamed for the violence. Are we back to step one here with these comments coming out of this Friends of Syria meeting?
I think, unfortunately, we seem to go round in a circle, yes. There is violence from both sides because this is a fight for power. And people, once they've started killing, either to keep power or to gain it, are hardly likely to step back. And the question now is, are the allegations against Russia supposedly supplying weapons to Assad really a smokescreen for what the West may be doing on behalf of radical groups, if you like, repeating the Afghan experiment of the 1980s now in Syria? And I wonder whether we may not find that 20 years down the line we won't be terribly happy about the consequences, even if the regime in Syria, as in Afghanistan, has faults, many faults.
Professor Mark Almond of International Relations at Bilkent University in Turkey, speaking to us from Oxford. Thanks for that.
Thank you.